I am very excited to bring on Matt Kinsella of Infleqtion, the CEO of Infleqtion, to ask him all kinds of questions about his company and the quantum industry in general. Matt, welcome to the show. Nice to have you.
It's great to be here, Majid. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. So I have so many questions about Infleqtion, and I was doing a deep dive into the website last night, but I think a good starting point might be just kind of what is Infleqtion and what sort of specialties do you have, and kind of just like a very basic 101 understanding, maybe that elevator pitch.
Sounds great. A good way to do that might be to give you a little bit of my background, because it overlaps quite a bit with the company, and that'll be probably a story arc that'll tell the answer to your question. So before I came to Infleqtion, I was an investor at a firm called Maverick Capital for 19 years. And I wore several different hats there. I was a public equity investor at Maverick on the hedge fund side of the business for 9 years. And then I helped us start our early stage venture capital fund in early 2015. We launched on Jan 1, 2015. And I got very curious. And so I looked at a lot of the quantum companies that were around at the time and ultimately decided that starting something from scratch might be a smart risk reward. So then I started meeting professors instead of companies. And ultimately it led me to a gentleman named Dana Anderson, who is really the pioneer of a quantum modality called neutral atoms. And so we seeded Dana at Maverick. We helped basically commercialize the technology. And then I've been on the board ever since, helping build the company from my board seat, and then joined full-time at the beginning of last year. And so Infleqtion is a quantum technologies company. And when I say quantum, and I'm guessing your audience knows this and you know this, but just to make sure in level set terms, we're talking about the world of the very small, right? The atomic and the subatomic levels. And when we say quantum technologies, it's taking those very strange and very bizarre properties, quantum mechanical in nature, and turning them into products. And when I say modality, like neutral atoms, it's just the way we go about doing that. How do we turn those quantum mechanical properties into products? And so what I found so incredible about Dana and this neutral atom modality is that, unlike many of the other quantum modalities where they're really only good for building one product that's computing, neutral atoms are highly flexible. And so you can build a number of different products based upon this core underlying quantum technology. And so that was the initial seed thesis of the business going back to early 2018, and continues to be our mission today. It is to commercialize quantum technologies utilizing the neutral atom modality that range from quantum sensing products to quantum computers. And we were really following NVIDIA's market development strategy of taking this core neutral atom technology and pointing it at a few different end markets. First, the ones that we could achieve quantum advantage at today, like timekeeping or quantum RF, and we can get into these areas into much more detail. And then exploring if neutral atoms was going to be a good modality for quantum computing. And it turns out it's a very good modality for quantum computing. It hadn't really been explored back in 2018. So what's happened since 2018 until today is that we've built a very good, scalable, scaled commercial business, about $29 million in revenue in 2024. On a lot of these quantum sensing products where we have real commercial advantage today. And neutral atoms have gone from a dark horse to really the leading candidate for most of the metrics that matter to get to a gate-based fault-tolerant quantum computer. So long-winded answer, but hopefully that sets the stage.
That's amazing. So much to go through. So let's start with all the different kind of companies and all the different modalities, right?
Yep.
So what makes neutral atom? You kind of just mentioned that it's emerging as maybe one of the front runners. What do you like about neutral atoms? And specifically, I know that the strength of Infleqtion is both sensing and quantum computing. So maybe you could talk about how neutral atom works in both of those as well.
Sure. So one of the big features of neutral atoms is they take place at room temperature. So you don't require cryogenic freezers or dilution fridges. And that is, at the core, what opens this modality up to being so flexible. So instead of having to sit in a data center inside a freezer, they can be field deployed. And because it doesn't require mechanical systems like freezers, everything we do is based upon basically lasers and then these ultra high vacuum cells that Dana has been making for the better part of several decades. those can be shrunk, they can be cost down, they can be hardened, they can be put out in the field. And so one of the best features of neutral atoms is the fact that it takes place at room temperature. It's all based on lasers and these ultra high vacuum cells. And therefore, this technology can ride your typical cost down curve that the rest of technology has been riding for the last 70 years or so. And it gets smaller, it gets faster, it gets cheaper. And so with that as the backdrop, we've been able to turn this neutral atom technology into clocks that are about the size of, call it like 3 pizza boxes stacked on top of each other, that perform 3 orders of magnitude. So 1,000 times better than classical clocks. We can talk about what does performance mean in the world of clocks. We can turn those into RF antennas that can do almost magical things that classical antennas can't do. And then, as you mentioned, as we talked about before, turns out that neutral atom architecture is also good for building quantum computers. And the room temperature aspect of the quantum computers helps keep the costs down. It helps reduce the complexities, and that's why they've been scaling really rapidly as one of the modalities that's leading the way for quantum computing.
So I was perusing your website, which is a great website, by the way. I like that it has just the information's organized very neatly. I stumbled upon your roadmap, and I saw that it was revised in September of 2025, so fairly recently. And we've seen a lot of revisions from quantum companies. Can you talk a little bit about the roadmap and kind of what that revision was and where you guys see yourselves by 2030?
Sure. So, and we're referring specifically to our quantum computing roadmap. Talk about the roadmap for our other products. It's funny. It's like the roadmap for quantum computing is your typical up and to the right curve, right? It's, we're going to add more qubits over this period of time, and the quality of those qubits is going to get higher. The roadmap for the rest of the technologies really is a down to the right curve, because we already are at the point where we have products that are better than classical standards. And so all the engineering is going into shrinking and costing those products down and integrating the underlying photonics to get them to chip scale. But let's focus on the quantum computing roadmap, because that's the one you're referencing. So the key to the kingdom in quantum computing is logical qubits. Do you think, should we define that term, or do you think the audience understands?
I think you should define it just in case.
Sure. So when people talk about qubits, there's both physical and there's logical qubits. Physical qubits they're called quantum bits, right? They're the underlying logic layer of a quantum computer. In our case, the way we make our qubits is we trap either rubidium or cesium atoms inside those same ultra high vacuum cells I was referencing before. We individually hold each of those atoms in place. We array them in a grid, and each of those atoms becomes a qubit. And so those are our physical qubits. We have a machine with 1,600 physical qubits, and those are just atoms held in free space with lasers. But what is a logical qubit? A logical qubit is a cluster of very high quality qubits that has been error corrected, and now you have a qubit, a logical qubit that can actually do computation. Unfortunately, physical qubits are very prone to noise and error, so they need to be high quality and they need to be error corrected. Now that we have logical qubits, those are really the building blocks of quantum computers. And it wasn't until 2023 that the world got its first logical qubits. And so until 2023, really probably right around the time you got really curious about quantum, right around the Google Willow announcement, it was unclear as to whether we'd ever get logical qubits. And so logical qubits are going to be what enables quantum computers to do things that classical computers can't do. And so if you look at our roadmap, it's all based on logical qubits. And logical qubits takes both physical qubits and the quality of those qubits into account. And so I think it's a simplistic metric to focus on. And so there's really only a handful of companies that have achieved logical qubits. Infleqtion is one of them. And we got our first logical qubits at the end of 2024. And our roadmap states that we'll have 8 by the end of this year, but we announced earlier this year that we had 12. And so they're in the revision up from 8 to 12. And then we believe by 2028, we'll have 100 logical qubits. And 100 logical qubits is the level at which quantum computers can start to do things that classical computers can't do. I don't think it's going to be blow your mind ChatGPT moment where you've interacted with a Turing complete computer for the first time, like we all experienced back in November of 2022. But we'll start to see things that you just could never do on a classical computer being done by quantum computers, largely in the material science realm at that point. So some of the things that you need to do to model the discovery of new materials require incredibly complex modeling of how the electrons will interact. that's just something that it's too complex. There's too many moving pieces for a classical computer, even the most powerful GPU cluster, to do. And those are the types of things that quantum computers will excel at. So you'll start to see quantum advantage after 100 logical qubits in that material science realm. And then as we scale from 100 logical qubits, which again, end of 2028, to 1,000 logical qubits by 2030, you'll start to see much more interesting things that you can do moving into the world of drug discovery. And then ultimately, further down the line, putting things like encryption at risk, because you can actually do the types of calculations that encryption is based on, because classical computers can't do those types of calculations.
Fascinating. So this past week, about 6 days ago, IonQ CEO Niccolo de Masi went to Congress and was asked a question about China and China's lead, or if they're behind or whatever. And he made a remark, something along the lines of that he thinks that IonQ is about 5 years ahead of China progress. And I wonder if you have any thoughts or Infleqtion or just wider thoughts about the industry and where we are relative to other countries in the world, especially China.
Well, we have to acknowledge and make no mistake that it is a race between the US and our allies in China. And the stakes are very high. And the race isn't just on quantum computing, but it's on that whole swath of quantum technologies that I had outlined to you. And we can talk about what the national security implications are for each of those, because the security implications for sensors and clocks and RF antennas are absolutely massive, as is the national security implications for quantum computing. And so let's just focus in on quantum computing, but I do think it's worthwhile talking about where China is on the quantum sensing side of the world too. So China's taking a very different approach, as they often do, to developing their quantum computers, and that is a very top-down directed approach, right? They are allocating massive sums of money off of the state's balance sheet to research universities and basically telling them, this is what we want you to do. And the US is taking a very different approach. Like China is out investing the US by more than 2x, probably closer to 3x. But the US is relying on our capitalist system, right? So companies like Infleqtion or IonQ raising private capital and duking it out on the battlefield, right? To the best company will win. I personally will bet on the capitalist innovation engine any day of the week, but it's a formidable opponent to be up against in China, because they are putting massive resources behind this. So where are we relative to China? I probably wouldn't be quite as dismissive as Niccolo was. I think
me either, by the way.
What's that?
Me either.
I think in many cases, China is ahead of the US in areas of quantum. I deeply believe the US is going to win the race, but there are areas where China is ahead, and I think they appropriately identified it as a critical technology and started to state sponsor it much earlier than the US did. The US put the National Quantum Initiative into place about 5 years ago. It was relatively small in the scheme of things, $1 billion. But they now have identified what they're terming quantum and battlefield information dominance as one of the 6 national security issues that the US needs to focus on. Interestingly, I think that actually focuses much more in on the quantum sensing side of things for battlefield information dominance. But we are coming to the realization that quantum, was down selected from 14 critical technologies to one of 6. So I think we are taking it, with the level of seriousness that is appropriate. But China's it's a serious race. We must win it, because I don't want to sound, overly bombastic, but I think the side that does win this is going to have a lot to say about what the next 100 years of planet Earth look like.
Amazing. So John Levy was just on the show a couple days ago, CEO of SPAC, and he mentioned something along the lines, and I thought this was really profound what he said. He said that just because the world order has been, the US has been ahead in tech for decades and decades and decades, does that mean that will always be the case? Right. And I like how you're talking about the capitalist system. I guess what worries me a little bit as I kind of report on and observe the quantum sector is it does seem a little bit of fractured and disorganized, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
the government kind of just is like, oh well, we've been hearing quantum is going to be around the corner for the last 20 years, and it hasn't been. So we have a skeptical kind of government, but also they're making it a priority, but also funding is hard, and you're kind of seeing this like wishy-washiness, but it feels like it's a really, really, really bad time to be dragging feet. It feels like that's just kind of the observation that I've had. I think it's important to acknowledge kind of where we are in a more global, global race, and that it's not just the US and it's not just US companies. So speaking on Infleqtion specifically, so you mentioned a couple of things. You said that a lot of companies talk about quantum computing specifically, but Infleqtion has an interesting, you kind of have more tentacles with the sensing and RF and all the different things you do as far as quantum is concerned. And you also mentioned that those have national security implications. So could you go a little bit more into how like Infleqtion would potentially be able to mitigate those risks? What are the risks and how can Infleqtion mitigate them?
If we go back to the initial investment thesis on Infleqtion, it was, and neutral atoms are somewhat uniquely suited to pursue this strategy because of the flexibility of the modality. But you can think of almost a curve of complexity on what you can do with neutral atom technology. And at the lower left-hand side of that curve is you can make clocks. And these clocks have performance advantages that are measured in the orders of magnitude relative to classical clocks. Again, I will tell you why that matters, because someone might say, why do you care if you can keep time better? There's actually huge national security implications. But we can also make RF antennas that can receive the entire electromagnetic spectrum. So normally you need an antenna that roughly matches the size of the wavelength that you're receiving, right? And so inside your iPhone, you have very small antennas because you're receiving very high frequency, very short wavelength signals. You probably have 10 of them or more inside your iPhone. But you've probably seen, or maybe even dragged up onto your roof yourself, a big antenna, right? And put it up there. And the reason why that's big is because you're receiving longer wavelength signals. And at the extreme, submarines have to dangle antennas that are 1 kilometer long off their back because they're receiving very, very, very long wavelength, low frequency signals. It's the only kind that can penetrate water. We can collapse all of that down to something the size of a sugar cube to receive that entire spectrum. So game-changing technology. And then finally, you can build inertial sensors. So equipment that can help you navigate and without having to access GPS. So incredibly precise onboard navigation systems because they can sense the forces of acceleration, left turns, right turns, gravity going up, etc. And so those are the suite of products that are outside of quantum computing that you can focus quantum technologies, particularly neutral atoms on. And I listed them sort of in the order of complexity, right? And then the most complex thing you can do is you can build quantum computers. And so our goal has been to monetize those areas as you get quantum advantage in each of them. And again, we're riding that complexity curve up and to the right, sort of similar to how NVIDIA did it, right? They took their GPU engine, they pointed it at graphics. So gaming, right? They took their GPU engine, they pointed it at crypto mining, then at physics, and then ultimately the crown jewel of large language models came along, and their GPU engine is very well suited to address that. I think of the same strategy with our neutral atom engine. We're addressing these more near-term applications, then ultimately quantum computing will become advantageous to do computing via quantum as opposed to classical, and will be very well suited to address that. Now, what are the national security implications of each of those different product lines I've mentioned? Let's talk about clocks first, and then let's talk about GPS. So what is GPS? GPS is a position, navigation, and timing system. But in reality, it's a lowercase p, lowercase n, capital T. The timing stamp that comes down to us from GPS is actually the most important service that comes from GPS. And GPS is increasingly becoming prone to being spoofed or denied. It's a huge problem. I mean, you're starting to read about it more and more. A couple of months ago, Ursula von der Leyen's plane was hit with a GPS denial attack. They had to circle the air. I mean, they were flying around blind for hours, and they had to resort to World War II navigation tactics, literally finding beacons on the ground and following them by eyesight to get back to the landing field. We're talking almost 100-year-old technology in 2025 because there were no other alternatives other than accessing GPS, and this is happening more and more and more. And so GPS is becoming increasingly prone to spoofing or denial. And denial is just straight up, you can't use it. Spoofing is it makes you think you're somewhere else, or it makes you think that it's some different time. And the amount of the critical infrastructure that is dependent on GPS, whether it's for synchronization from timing or navigation, which ultimately is derived from a timing stamp, it's absolutely massive. And it's not just navigation, it's the financial markets, it's the electricity grid, it's the RF networks. If you can't synchronize the signals that are being sent, they just won't work. And this is dependent upon 30 satellites that are circling the Earth that send a very faint signal down. So how do you start to make yourself robust against denial or spoofing? You can put those 3 pizza box units that I've talked about that we make that keep time better than GPS, and put them locally. So now you have an unspoofable, undeniable concept of time to do synchronization. And that would really make us quite robust against a pretty darn easy attack that you could wage on the US economy. And then even more scary, in a hot war, the first thing to go is GPS. I mean, there is no GPS in the Ukraine right now in the hot areas. And so the side that can navigate and synchronize and communicate without access to GPS will have a massive tactical advantage. And so maybe I'll pause there because I just threw a lot out, but that's the national security implications to clocks alone and how quantum can help solve that.
I think you and your company have some very unique insight into how things could go wrong on the modern battlefield and modern warfare. Can you speak to quantum sensing, quantum clocks, quantum computing? Can you kind of maybe paint a picture of what could go wrong if we are behind in these critical technology areas, like how an adversary could use those technologies against us? And you kind of alluded to it, but maybe paint a picture.
Sure. So let's just say, hypothetically, there's a conflict over the Strait of Taiwan, right? And you can assume there will be no GPS over that contested area. A side that could navigate with as much precision as if they had GPS versus a side who's kind of running around like chickens with their heads cut off is going to be almost certainly the victor, right? And so that's just the navigation piece. Now layer in timing and communication. Signals will be jammed. If you can continue to communicate and continue to synchronize operations in that fog of war, again, massive tactical advantage. If you have that and your opponent doesn't, it almost guarantees victory. But probably more importantly, it acts as a huge deterrent to even trying in the first place, right? And so those are the types of things that, ranging from the ability to navigate, the ability to communicate, the ability to synchronize, are going to be huge advantages in any kind of conflict, let alone, if you can run calculations and optimizations on a quantum computer, those will be massive advantages too. But even in the more near term, just this more basic sensing equipment and the precision level at which you can sense, especially in the absence of GPS, will be a huge advantage. And maybe I'll give you a couple other examples. If you think about radar, right? Radar is a very old technology, but increasingly we're starting to have multi-static radar. So those are radar systems with multiple heads. Now, the better that you can synchronize what those multiple heads are seeing between them, the clearer the picture becomes. And you can think about, if you can synchronize the time and the frequency between those different sensor heads at much more precise levels, you can think of it going from that like glowing dot, beep, beep that you usually think of as radar to something that's more akin to 4K. And instead of seeing a swarm of drones, you can see individual drones. And so the precision that you can track your enemy's movements will go up materially. And then finally, just the precision at which you can target will go up materially too. You can probably get to accuracy within a few meters with current navigation systems. You can drop that down to much, much more precise pinpoint level attacks. So we're talking huge implications for battlefield advantage. Again, why is it one of the 6 national security priorities, quantum battlefield information dominance? It's for all those reasons.
So how does Infleqtion serve kind of those areas, and do you see like Infleqtion being more involved in the military or battlefield of the future? Is that a focus for the company?
It is, absolutely. And it's a focus, one, because I feel deeply that the US needs to have these capabilities from a national security perspective, but it's also where we found product market fit early. So all of our technologies are very dual use in nature, but given the level of precision that they're able to provide, the dogs are eating the dog food, for lack of a better term, in the national security market before the commercial market. And I believe, and our entire strategy is based on this, that the commercial market's going to need these technologies as well over time. And so what we're doing is we're focusing on the area where the dogs are eating the dog food. We're driving up volumes, which allows us to drive down costs and increase performance. And as you can reach the price points that are, matching and in many cases going below the classical technologies with several order of magnitude improvement, then we'll see broad-based commercial adoption. In some cases, it's like dropping a Ferrari in traffic right now in the commercial markets, though, and in the military and the national security markets, that Ferrari is free to drive as fast as it needs to and provide real advantage. So yes, the DoD is our biggest customer. The Ministry of Defense is a big customer. We sell only to U.S. allies, largely the AUKUS, folks, so U.S., UK, and Australia. The intelligence community is a big customer, DOE. And so think of all the folks that manage a lot of the critical infrastructure or national security areas are big customers of Infleqtion today.
I didn't know all of that. I want to ask, and these numbers may or may not be 100% correct. You'll probably know them better than me. The commercial strategy and revenue growth for Infleqtion. So I wrote down here about 29 million in trailing revenue. Correct. And a $50 million backlog with 300 million pipeline. Are these mostly military customers? Is that or is it a vast array of different sort of demand for their products?
Yes, your numbers are quite close to correct. So okay. 29 million in trailing 12-month revenue, 50 million in either booked or awarded business. So okay. Backlog means something very specific for GAAP accounting, and this metric is basically business that we've been told or we've signed the contract that we're going to execute against over the future period, and then a pipeline, which is really like identified customer opportunities, that is approximately $300 million or so. It is not. So a good percentage of it is military use cases, but increasingly more of it is coming from commercial or non-military use cases. And so we have sold clocks to data centers, to synchronize servers with much greater precision. We sell clocks to satellites, and so ground stations that have to synchronize with the satellites. We sell clocks to laboratories for the synchronization of their underlying equipment. And so the non-military use cases are starting to grow. But I think it's safe to say that probably greater than 50% is maybe not military in nature, but in that broader national security umbrella, which can take into account critical infrastructure, so DOE, et cetera. And that is still where the majority of the demand is today. And over time, you'll see more and more of the commercial opportunities open up. NASA is a very big customer of ours, for instance. It sounds like buzzword salad, but quantum in space is actually a very, very large market opportunity, which we can discuss. But those are that's how I'd classify the revenue from the past as well as the opportunity in the future.
Yeah. Let's dig into that quantum in space and why that's an opportunity.
Sure. So we have had quantum up in the International Space Station since 2018. Infleqtion was the first company to ever put quantum up into space. And space is really important for quantum for a number of reasons. So the being able to do things in microgravity allows you to do things that you can't do on the Earth's surface. And so there are ways to do drug discovery and other types of experiments that you actually require microgravity to achieve. And so being on the International Space Station is the best way to do that. But even more interesting is what those systems up in space perched on their from their vantage point can do on Earth's surface. So what we're working right now on is sending some gravimetry equipment to space. And what you can do with that is you can actually sense gravity and changes in gravity on the Earth's surface with extreme precision. And you can infer a lot of really interesting data about the Earth's surface based upon the change in gravity. Because what is change in gravity? It's change in mass. So you can track the melting of polar ice caps. You can track the depletion of aquifers. You can see where droughts might be coming up. You can see, where there could be civil unrest coming because of drought in the future. And then ultimately you can start to see what's happening below the Earth's surface. And so our tunnels being dug, our nuclear materials being moved, and a lot of really interesting things that you can infer from gravity. And actually, as you're up in space, you can see a very large space of what's happening on the Earth's surface. As you bring that closer to the Earth's surface, you can actually be much more pinpointed. So you can say, oh, here's what's happening, right at this little chunk of land, and this is what's happening underneath that land. And so those are a couple of examples. Beyond that, there has been quantum technology, basic quantum technology in the form of atomic clocks in space. So I wouldn't classify it as quantum technology, but atomic clocks are based on some of the same principles. There's an atomic clock in each of the satellites for GPS today. And what those clocks do is they synchronize with these massive clocks here on Earth's surface. We can put our quantum optical clocks in satellites and have incredible precision without needing to synchronize to the bigger clocks here on Earth, and then use that as the basis for time distribution from space. And then finally, we talked about GPS denial. There's no GPS in space, right? So if you're going to navigate with extreme precision in space, you actually need those incredibly precise sensors on board your spacecraft to maneuver. And then this sounds kind of crazy, but we have to establish lunar time as a time zone. And in order to synchronize lunar time to time here on the Earth, you need very precise clocks that are acting in synchronization and that aren't drifting, right? How if you don't set your watch for a while, it'll be off by a few minutes. We can't have the lunar time being drifting from Earth time. So it must, have very precise clocks on both ends that have been synchronized almost perfectly.
I also know that quantum networking happens, like quantum communication, like signals sent to satellites, and then it's unhackable.
Right.
Type of community. Is that something that Infleqtion is working on?
We don't focus on that aspect of quantum. Really, the one aspect we don't is the quantum networking side. But it's a very important thing. It's the nice thing about our underlying the areas we focus on is they all are very interrelated. And so, side note, I'll talk about the quantum sensing and quantum networking in a second. But I was talking about the products that are on this continuum of complexity, right? And so we have, let's say, clocks to start. And what we do to build our clocks is we take atoms in the ultra high vacuum cells, we excite them, and then that energy transition of excited to neutral, or so excited to ground becomes effectively a very stable frequency reference, and that is basically the ticking of a clock. But ultimately, what is that? That's taking advantage of the superposition of the atom. And superposition is one of the critical building blocks for a quantum computer. I talked about our quantum RF sensors, right? Then they can receive the entire electromagnetic spectrum. That's actually putting the atoms in something called the Rydberg state, which is the most excited they can be before they become an ion. So you can think about the electron way out in orbit. And when it's way out in orbit, it becomes sensitive to that entire electromagnetic spectrum. Interestingly, the way that you entangle atoms, you have to put them into their Rydberg state first. So as we're mastering our quantum RF products, we're basically getting better and better at entanglement. And then finally, our inertial sensing equipment, we have to make those atoms ultra cold. I'd said that this is done at room temperature, but if you think about what is cold is the lack of motion of atoms. So we hold them in place with lasers such that these atoms are moving so little, they become the coldest place in the known universe. So you take superposition plus entanglement plus ultra cold, those are basically the building blocks to our quantum computers. So there's immense leverage between everything we do. I don't actually see the leverage in quantum networking, which is why we've chosen not to focus on it today. But it is a very important quantum technology. And as you pointed out, you can actually establish communication networks that are entirely unhackable. And this is one area where China is quite ahead of the US. A few years ago, they demonstrated an encrypted signal sent from the ground to a satellite and back down to Earth, that there is no way that we could ever intercept that signal, which is pretty scary.
Even the MIT Quantum Index report released this year shows they're very, very far ahead in the networking piece. So at least battlefield communication or any sort of communication that would need to be unhackable, they would probably have an advantage on. That's why I would get a little bit cautious about just assuming that we're ahead in QC quantum computing.
Totally agree. And here's the thing: it's like every time you see an announcement out of China, it usually follows some announcement we made, and that shows where they're just right behind us. I wouldn't be shocked if they're holding holding some things back. I
just said that
further ahead than we might think they are.
I mean, it could very well be a strategy. Like once it's in the Western media, then we'll release. But what motivation do they have, or what do they gain from sharing where they're at in the process? Then they have a more organized US that puts a ton more money into it and catches up faster, or would they rather the US lag That's
Totally,
my concern.
totally agree. I would sure
So,
want my competitors to think I was further behind than I was.
yeah, that's why it's a bit dangerous. So maybe next time Congress invites people, they can invite you out there, Matt. So as far as the SPAC, so we know Infleqtion has been private, and you've obviously been building some amazing products and have a suite of products to offer different customers, both commercial and military and so on. So you have this SPAC with Churchill Capital Group. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep.
Under ticker symbol CCCX.
That's right.
And maybe can you talk a little bit about why the SPAC route and not just the IPO route, and how you see that playing out?
Sure. So we raised our Series C at the beginning of 2024. We raised $100 million, and our burn is actually relatively low compared to other quantum companies, and for a lot of different reasons. But one of them is because we bring gross profit dollars in with the sales of some of our our sensing equipment, and so we were well capitalized for many years. As I would lay in bed at night thinking about all the reasons why Infleqtion might fail, which sadly is what I spent a lot of my time worrying about.
That's the work of the CEO.
yeah, exactly. Only the paranoid survive, as the great Andy Grove said, right? It was really interesting what kept coming back to me as the reasons we might fail. And a lot of the reasons actually didn't have to do with us getting the tech right or us being able to commercialize, which sounds kind of crazy given this is quantum. But most of the reasons why we might fail, or the scenarios that might come about to cause us to fail, came back to capital. And it's not that I was worried about us running out of capital for any, really foreseeable reason, but having been an investor for as long as I had been, I know that these cycles really, they come and go, right? And so if 2.5 years from now, when it was time for us to go raise our Series D, and it happened to happen at a time when the private and the public markets were not accommodative to supporting deep tech, that is the existential threat to the business. And so I started to think about how can we take that existential threat off the table? And really the only time to do that is when you're at an extreme position of strength. So we had just raised the Series C, we didn't need capital. So I took that opportunity to start to evaluate ways to take that existential risk off the table. To your point, I did investigate going down traditional IPO paths. That would have been possible, but it would have taken a while. It would have been an 18 to 24 month journey. And I feel like speed is of the essence at this time. We could have raised another private round, and we looked at that as well, and those opportunities were available to us. But we were able to find in Churchill really an absolutely world-class partner that helped us achieve all the goals that we wanted to achieve. And really the principles I went into this process with were, could we raise an amount of capital that would really take that existential risk off the table in most scenarios? Churchill has $416 million on in their trust, and we also raised $125 million pipe on top of that. So $540 million definitely takes that existential risk off the table for most go forward scenarios. Number two, do we have a high probability of actually getting it done? And Churchill has an incredible track record of delivering their trust onto the balance sheet of their partner companies. Number three, could we work with an absolutely amazing partner? And really, to the extent, Churchill's the best of the best in the SPAC world. And then finally, and this was not really one of the initial principles I went into it with, but it's going to be a very nice luxury to have, which is we will now have a public currency to make acquisitions. And I think there will be some quantum companies who might fall victim to that existential threat of capital, and Infleqtion could ultimately be a good home for them. I, as an investor, have a high degree of skepticism for big acquisitions just because they often don't work out. But technology tuck-ins that directly accelerate your roadmap can be very, very effective, and they are much easier to do if you have a public currency to make those happen. And so when I put that all into a blender, it looked like this is a terrible analogy, but like the right smoothie, right? And so that's why we are going down that path, and it's it's absolutely the right path for us.
Any quantum company at this point I've been investing in, it's no secret to my listeners. And when I saw, I was actually a little bit late to the party, didn't realize this was happening, but then definitely got my position as well in CCCX.
Well, as I laid in bed at night thinking about the existential risks to Infleqtion, a government shutdown wasn't actually in the list of things that
The
I
longest
had
in history?
Yeah, I probably need to include that now. But when the government is shut down, the SEC is shut down, and one needs the SEC to review your filings to actually go forward with the public process. So the SEC is now reopened. We announced several weeks ago that we are on file, so our filings are done, and it's just going to be how many turns do you have to make with the SEC? So we're on file with our S4 and our audited financials. The SEC will review them. They'll give us comments. We'll address those comments. We'll send it back to them. And the determining factor of how long this will take will be, do we get that one and done, or is that multiple iterations?
A lot of people were severely affected by the government shutdown.
Yeah.
And it was a very long one.
It was one. Yeah.
So final question, and I'll give you an opportunity to give any closing thoughts. When you compare yourself to the quantum companies that trade in the public markets,
yep,
do you see Rigetti or IonQ or D-Wave or any of these public companies? I know Xanadu also announced a merger. Do you see any of them as peers? Do you kind of see like a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3? Where do you kind of see yourself? I know IonQ, if you ask them, they'd say we're the best quantum company in the world, 5 years ahead of our competition. But where do you see yourself?
Well, I have huge respect for all the other quantum companies that are out there, both in the public markets and the private markets, and a lot of smart people are working on a lot of really hard problems. Maybe I'll answer the question in this way. If you look at IonQ and you look at Rigetti and you look at Infleqtion, and then maybe Xanadu, depending when they come public, they each represent one of the different modalities on how to do quantum, right? So trapped ions is the modality that IonQ has been based on. Rigetti is a superconducting company. Xanadu is a photonics company, and then Infleqtion is a neutral atom company. So we're differentiated in that each of us is pursuing a fundamentally different strategy, or fundamentally different technology on how to take advantage of some of the really weird stuff down at the quantum world, right? And I'd say maybe trapped ions and neutral atoms are close cousins because we're working with atoms that don't have a charge. Trapped ions have a charge, and that's probably maybe for next time we can explain some of the fundamental differences between those two. And then superconducting, actually you build real superconducting materials and put them inside of a freezer. And then with photonics, you're actually trading light into photons, right? Photons into qubits. So we differentiate ourselves in that we're pursuing neutral atoms, and we'll be the only publicly traded neutral atom company. And then our strategy has been fundamentally different as well, as opposed, and this was going back to my initial thesis in the business. Instead of basically just building a computer until this computer becomes better than classical computers, our strategy has always been to monetize along the way, right? Point this neutral atom engine at the areas where we have quantum advantage and then monetize the heck out of it. And then because of that strategy, we have quite a bit of revenue, especially relative to some of the other players. And so commercialization is critical for any business. And I think it's so important to not just build in the lab. You have to be shipping product, getting feedback from the customers, learning how to engineer systems, learning how to make sure systems work as they're supposed to work, right? And all those things only are possible if you're selling things and then getting the feedback from the market. And so I think Infleqtion's always really tried to have a commercial first mentality to the quantum world, and we'll continue that as we're a public company.
Excellent. So I'll leave this one up to you. So we have a lot of retail investors that follow this channel that have been beat up a couple times in 2025. Of course, investing in quantum is a super volatile trade. There's uncertainty, and there's a very loud and vocal opposition to, like, people just hate quantum, like, for some reason. I'm kind of think about like 1999 NVIDIA, like, oh, I hate these GPUs. These GPUs are crap. The CPU will be king forever, whatever. Just this resistance to change, but also this negativity that orbits quantum and quantum efforts. And it's not like it's magic. It's really, really hard. And there's a lot of really smart people that are working on really hard problems, and including
Absolutely.
your company and your scientists. So maybe you could give some closing thoughts to retail investors and those that take the chance on investing in this technology.
Sure. Well, let me caveat this by saying, as an investor myself for a long time, I'm always very cautious on giving any specific investment advice.
Sure.
Obviously,
Of course,
right?
of course.
But I think you look at my actions, right? I was a partner at a very successful investment fund. And those are the types of jobs that people don't usually leave, right? And I left that to come run a quantum company. So I'm voting very much with my actions that I believe that this is the future. And I think it is wonderful for retail investors that they have options to invest in quantum, because a lot of times you don't have the options to invest in the next big trend, and those only reside in the private markets inside venture capital funds that only accredited investors can get access to. So I think if you believe, which I do, that quantum is going to be incredibly impactful to humanity over the course of the next decade, it's a wonderful situation to have liquid public investment opportunities ahead of you. I would say do your due diligence. It probably is not going to be just a up and to the right. It's going to be choppy, as you said. People have experienced a lot of volatility, but if you take a multi-year view on this really important technology, I think it's a wonderful thing that retail investors have the opportunity to do. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Once there is certainty within a technology, right? Once NVIDIA was dominating the GPUs, then that was reflected in the valuation of the company. But when there's uncertainty and when technology is developing, that's the risk, right? The risk is like, well, until all of the hurdles are jumped over, then that's the risk.
It's exactly right, and you're dead right. Once it becomes riskless, there's no upside opportunity anymore, right? Once all the risks are, and interesting anecdote, as a public market investor for a very long time, I've been following NVIDIA for almost 20 years, and it's unreal how until just a couple of years ago, the usual sentiment around NVIDIA was one of negativity, because there was always, this gaming market's not that big, right? That's going to tap out, and then there's no world for NVIDIA past the gaming market. And then all of a sudden, they figure out the next thing that's incredibly important technology you'll go address. And it's been really a masterclass in market development on how those folks, and Jensen in particular, has always just found the next thing. And so there is, it doesn't surprise me that there's a ton of people who are negative on quantum, because tons of people were negative on NVIDIA for decades. And so I think, and by the time it becomes unilaterally positive, valuations will be significantly higher.
This has been amazing. And I do have, unfortunately, one quick bonus question.
Okay, no problem.
Quick bonus question. I know this is on the shrinking timelines of all these companies. So IonQ's, their timeline is shrink. Quantinuum, IBM, this year, and I think even Infleqtion's, I don't know what the September 2025 revision was, but it looks like a lot of these quantum companies are shrinking their timeline toward fault-tolerant quantum computing. Any final thoughts on what's happening in the sector, and maybe what you're most excited about going forward?
So I'll bring it back to logical qubits, which I think are those are the keys to the kingdom to getting to fault-tolerant quantum computing. And there's a few other metrics that are going to matter, like the gate depth of these logical qubits. But let's just keep the numbers simple and say that around 100 logical qubits is where I think we'll start to see some form of quantum advantage. And because we just got logical qubits in 2023, I think people are trying to figure out how fast we scale. Going from 0 to 1 was very challenging. It took a very long time. And it's a very dynamic environment that we're operating in. And breakthroughs don't just happen linearly, right? They can be step functions. And so I think you're seeing these timelines move around because it's very real time. And I think we feel very good about our path to 100 logical qubits, and with 12 logical qubits, we're one of the leaders in logical qubit count. And so that's the way I'd answer your question. I think it's a very dynamic situation where people are trying to keep up with the breakthroughs that are happening, because they are happening at compoundingly faster rates. And that's one of the really hard things to grasp about quantum, is that it actually scales double exponentially, right? So Moore's law is an exponential curve. It's hard to extrapolate exponential growth let alone double exponential growth. The human mind just doesn't work that way all that well. And so it might be approaching more linear growth now. If I'm not mistaken, it was the compute power would basically double every 18 months is what it worked out to be. So that's fundamentally an exponential curve. You see double exponentials in quantum because you can basically double the underlying power, but each time you add a qubit, it actually exponentially increases the power. So you're talking double exponential growth curves, and those are very hard to forecast.
Gotcha. Well, Matt, this was an absolute pleasure. I learned a ton, and I think my audience and the wider audience, people that are interested in Infleqtion, are going to love hearing this and all this information from you. So thank you so much for taking your time.
Thank you. It was a really, really fun conversation. All right. Take care.
I hope you really enjoyed that content. If you would like to support the YouTube channel and the website, thequantumbull.com, I have 3 different membership options. I have the Quantum Bull, which starts at $4.99 a month, and you get members only videos and polls. The Golden Bull, which gets you access to our Discord, where we talk about trades. I share my buys and sells. I provide trade alerts, and we talk about all kinds of different stocks. To join, just click subscribe, the plus button by the subscribe, and you'll get a prompt and you can choose which level is best for you.